What's up, everybody? This is That Weird Show, and I, of course, am your weird host, The Shadow. And of course, as always, I hope everybody is doing well. I hope everybody managed to come through the insane, blistering weather that's been kind of just traveling around in the heat dome, as they call it. And yet, strangely enough, you know, here in Minnesota, it's not unusual for us to see hot weather like that, but it is strange when I look at how fast it hit, because I was working the carnival that weekend and I was just out there trying to, do my job, get paid, go home, make sure everybody had a good time and all that. And I ended up finding out that, I get there and I open up the game and I'm thinking, okay, it's going to be hot. Well, once the parade hit, all of a sudden it was just like, bam, out of nowhere. And it didn't just go up in temperature, but it went up in humidity and all that. And I was just, within a minute, I was sweating. My shirt was sticking to my chest. And I mean, it was just ugly. And I mean, ugly. So give me a quick second here while I try to share this out to a couple of places here. And then I'm going to get on with the show. It's going to be a very interesting show because I came across it. There are elements about this show that I've known for a while, but I came across something recently that just kind of had me thinking. And one more quick shot here as I try to get things going here. And for some reason, Facebook has been giving me a lot of problems with streaming to certain pages. I don't understand why. I don't understand what the deal is, but it's Facebook. So when it comes to Meta, you never know what you're going to get. You never know when it's going to get screwed up. You never know anything because, well, let's just be honest. Meta sucks. All right, so I'm going to go ahead and get rolling with this show and always make sure that I do my usual runaround and shout out. So first off, I do want to say that this show is streaming on Parapost Network Central. If you don't know what Parapost is, it is a page on Facebook that you can find with all kinds of podcasts, including this one, and as well as my other show, Rebel Fate. And if you have a show of your own, you can reach out to them, and they'll be more than happy to get your show on this page, and you can reach another spectrum of audience. And speaking of Rebel Fate, I am going to be doing a couple of episodes here in the next week or so, and you want to take a swing by the Rebel Faith Facebook page, and there you'll find all the flyers and info you need about when I post the date and time for my next couple of episodes. Also, I do have a side venture of graphic design, which is through Street Noise Design. Whatever graphic elements you need or graphic visuals you may need for your business, your social media ads, videos, whatever, reach out to me and I'll be more than happy to see what I can do to help you get yourself seen and out there. All right. Oh, and last but not least, this is also very important to me. I would really appreciate it if I can get you guys, whether you are following me by Facebook or YouTube or any other social media platform, take a swing by Rumble and follow me on Rumble, because YouTube is okay, but I've had them pull some of my videos just for telling the truth. And with at least Rumble, I can at least tell the truth and not worry about getting pulled. All right. That weird show, Gilgamesh, the Nephilim of Uruk. This is an interesting conversation, and it goes back quite a ways, actually. And if you know anything about the history of humanity, one of the first things that we're usually told is that ancient Sumeria is the first recognized developed civilization. And this is something that sprung up in Mesopotamia. And I mean, we're talking centuries ago. It was, like 6,000 years ago, I believe. They also came up with the first set of writing and language. They used what was known as cuneiform, and this is a wedge-type tool that is used to create a series of patterns to represent letters and words. And also, this kind of falls in parallel with some of the things that we see in the Hebrew history. If you know anything about the Bible, you recognize some of the names in ancient Sumeria in the Bible. And of course, we have one of the great patriarchs that comes from the land of Ur, which is just south and east of Uruk. So let's get into this whole unique conspiracy, because this one is not just a typical government conspiracy. Although it does involve the government, but it's not just the government. So if we go back in history, Gilgamesh, he was the legendary king of Sumeria. He comes out of the land of Uruk, and he's believed to have reigned sometime between 2800 and 2500 BC. Now, what's interesting is he is believed to have reigned for 126 years. And also, his name is one of the names that's mentioned on the King's List. And if for those of you who may have watched, Ancient Aliens or other conspiracy shows, the King's List, which is so unique. Here, let me find. I got to pull this up in my note because I want to make sure that I get this information right. When it came to the King's List, there was 8 kings, and each of them reigned for a certain amount of time. Now, this is where it gets interesting. If you add the total number of all the years that they reigned together, just these 8 kings, including Gilgamesh, it was 241,000 years. And that's just mind-blowing because, 241,000 years saw 8 kings. And the Sumerians is not the only one that had this kind of, view on certain people that were believed to have been, had some sort of divine connection. We also see something similar in the Bible. Methuselah lived to be 900, almost 1,000 years. Adam, he lived to be 930 years. And so you have these people that are able to have long life expectancies. But what's interesting is that when it comes to people like Gilgamesh and the 8 Kings, they are believed to be descended from heavenly beings. And in the Epic of Gilgamesh, when you look at how they described him as being 2/3 God, 1/3 human. They also said that he was a giant. And the reason why I'm bringing this piece up is because in the book of Genesis, I believe it's in Genesis, when it talks about some of the Nephilim, and this is also in the book of Enoch. Now, I will say this, just to clarify a couple of things before I go any further. I will make it clear as to, what certain things I say are, have been proven. And I'll also make it clear that what if I say something that's actually just theoretical or a guess. And also, I also want to clear this up because this is all important for this topic. I really wish people would stop saying that the Book of Enoch was banned, because it wasn't. It was simply not added in the canonical text because it did not have anything to do with the goal of the gospel. So everything from Genesis all the way up to the book of Revelation followed a specific purpose, which was to show us how man fell, how man needed to be redeemed, and that the only way to be redeemed would be through Jesus Christ, and this is where you get the gospel from. So that's the whole point of the Bible. Because if you go back and look into Jewish history, there's a lot more to it than just that. And though the book of Enoch was not added to the canonical text, it is still considered a religious text. It is still considered a holy literature. And in the book of Enoch, it talks about, and this is also mentioned in the Bible that we all have, it talked about how the angels, known as the Watchers, would come down to earth to watch over humanity. And there came a point where the angels or the Watchers fell in love with the daughters of men, and they would create the race known as the Nephilim. The Nephilim were said to be men of great stature, and this is where it gets interesting. They were also known as men of renown, and that usually kind of something you want to reserve for people that are like, extraordinary. Well, Gilgamesh would be considered a man of renown. And Gilgamesh, as I mentioned before, was believed to be 2/3 god and 1/3 human. He was also believed to be a giant, but he is documented as being somewhat of a brutal and tyrannical king. And then you have the Epic of Gilgamesh. Now, a lot of people like to say that the Epic of Gilgamesh is where the story of Noah's flood comes from. Well, we need to kind of clarify that a little bit. The Epic of Gilgamesh simply means that it was the first known writing of a global catastrophe. The Jewish people, the Hebrew, didn't really start writing. If you look at like the Paleo Hebrew, it didn't start writing until about, I want to say it was like 500 years before Jesus, maybe 1,000. I mean, it was a long time before they started transferring over to what's known as Aramaic, which is the most common square type lettering that you see now. But Proto-Hebrew, or Paleo-Hebrew, was the first written language for the Hebrew faith. Now, the other thing is that Hebrews are known for having a long history of oral traditions. In other words, they would always pass down their history by spoken word. So with that being said, it's not exactly accurate to say that the Epic of Gilgamesh that mentioned the flood is what gives birth to Noah's flood. Because the reality is, the Sumerians may have written about it first, but chances are the Hebrew have been talking about it before Sumer was even around. So just wanted to make that kind of clear that up. And I'm not trying to say that, the Bible is more right than the Epic of Gilgamesh, because there's cultures all around the world that talk about a global catastrophe that resulted in massive flooding everywhere. So back to the topic of Gilgamesh. Gilgamesh, if you look at his description, fit the whole idea of Nephilim right down to the T. He was tall, he was charismatic, he was a ruler, he was fierce, he was brutal, he was savage. And all of this, for some reason, people want to separate that from the Bible. This is where I start to talk about theory. The theory I have is, what if all the giants around the world that we hear, not just in the Middle East, but you hear stories about giants here in North America, South America, and Africa, all over the place. So is it possible that when we look at the book of Enoch and we look at the story of the Watchers and the offspring of the Nephilim, is it possible that the Watchers was a worldwide phenomenon? Is it possible that there were Watchers all around the world and it wasn't just the Middle East? I wonder about that, because it just seems so strange that such dynamic event, such unusual event that could change human history would happen in just one place. And if, when God said that he was tired of humanity and he was tired of, the offspring of the Watchers and the daughters of men, and he just wanted to wipe them out, and they was only right there in the Middle East, Do you think God would have covered the entire earth? Or do you think God would have done something similar to Sodom and Gomorrah and just rained down fire and brimstone just that area? Then again, I suppose, a worldwide flood would make more sense because that would make the eradication of the Nephilim much more thorough. So if we continue with the Epic of Gilgamesh, we find that, the god tried to destroy him. So they created another being known as Enkidu. But strangely enough, Gilgamesh and Enkidu would become friends. And of course, Enkidu would be sent down into the underworld, and Gilgamesh would go and try to rescue him. And, by the end of the Epic of Gilgamesh, Gilgamesh dies. And the story is that he was placed inside of what was known as the Resurrection Tomb. Now, this is, you can look at this however you want. But I'm curious, why would they call it a resurrection tomb? Why would they call it a chamber in which Gilgamesh could be resurrected from? Did they really think that he was going to come back to life? Did they believe that because he was two-thirds God, that he was able to escape death? Well, we don't know that. But that's what they believed. And then for centuries, the knowledge of where Uruk was and Gilgamesh's tomb was lost. Until 2003. In 2003, a German archaeologist using a ground-penetrating radar managed to find what he believed to be the remains of the city of Uruk, the same city in which Gilgamesh ruled his kingdom out of. And if you go by the text in the Epic of Gilgamesh, they say that he was buried near Uruk under the river Euphrates. And I think that's interesting because not only is Gilgamesh buried beneath this river of Euphrates, but the Bible mentions that there are other beings, demons, that are locked up beneath the river Euphrates. And that someday Euphrates will open up and they will be released unto the earth. So many parallels when you look at, history in that whole area. And it makes me think that there's got to be more than what we know. And it's always a good idea for us to be curious, to want to investigate, to want to learn more. And that's exactly what this German archaeologist did. He explored, he asked questions, he challenged ideas, he went against, the narrative, and he came across some information. Now, what's strange about this is 1 month after this excavation started, the Iraq War started. Now, that by itself doesn't seem so strange. What does make it strange is the fact that there are written reports by the local that mention that once the war started, they always saw U.S. military at the site of where this Uruk city was. They saw U.S. military there digging and pulling things out of the ground, loading up trucks, and driving off. And it was always done at night. So my question is, what does the U.S. military want with an archaeological site? Is it because there is some technology there? Is it because there is information that can completely change the history of humanity? Is it because there is document or artifact that could give them the upper hand in toppling whatever local government at that time was, which we know was Saddam Hussein? Because if you remember, Saddam Hussein considered himself to be a descendant of many of the great rulers of ancient Babylon. Was there something there that they were hoping to use against Saddam Hussein that would completely discredit everything he said? And of course, we all know the history about what happened to Saddam Hussein. A very brutal death for a brutal leader. But yeah, why is the U.S. military interested in an archaeological site out in the middle of nowhere? It really is. If, in fact, I'm going to pull up a couple of maps here to show you just how barren this area is. So give me a second here. Now, this first map, there we go. So this first map, as you can see, I've got some information that kind of explains a little bit more about the Mesopotamian area in the Sumerian Empire. Now, down in the circle area, that is where Euphrates is, and that's where the city of Uruk is. And if you look at the names, you'll recognize a lot of these names, but you'll see just how many areas around the city of Uruk is just empty. And in fact, I'll even pull up a close-up of that area. So yeah, there's the city of Uruk. There's the river Euphrates. There's the land of Ur, as I mentioned before. Ur is mentioned in the Bible, and there's nothing else out there. Now, what's also interesting is that this is also the area that many people believe was the site of the Garden of Eden. Which would make sense. The Garden of Eden. This is known as the crescent, the fertile crescent. This is known as the birthplace of civilization. Hence, the Sumerians and all that. But yeah, why is the military interested in this location? And between the ancient Mesopotamian area and Israel, no other place in the world is so highly contested and fought for. And that's what's interesting about this place. That's why, the story about the city of Gilgamesh and the resurrection tomb of Gilgamesh is so fascinating, because right now, Israel and Iran went off to war, and luckily we are in a ceasefire. But I'm curious, if that pops off again, what other historical sites are going to be at risk of being destroyed? What other distractions are we going to use to try to, extract information or artifact or anything like that? And speaking of which, shortly after Baghdad fell in the Iraq War, the National Museum was left unguarded. Now some of you may know the story, that talks about how looters went in there, and what was strange was the fact that when the looters first went in there, they said the place was already open. And then after investigating, they realized that before the main looters went in there and took everything else, there was a group of people that went in there with nobody else's knowledge. They gained access to the lower level, which is the most secured area in the museum. And not only that, but just to be able to get in, you have to know what you're doing. There are certain security protocols. There are certain types of locking mechanisms. Iraq was not playing game when they wanted to protect some of these artifacts that they kept in the lower level. And what's interesting is that as they investigated further, they realized that not only did this show that it was a very well orchestrated and planned out extraction of material, that they were looking for something very specific, because they left behind gold. They left behind precious stones. We're talking rubies and diamonds and, sapphire. They left behind silver. They left behind other stone artifacts. Anything that could be stolen and sold on the black market, or even just, kept for, whatever person of value you may find in it. They left all of that behind, but there were empty boxes all over. And the list that showed the inventory of what was supposed to be in those boxes disappeared as well. So let's look at that. 2003, the German archaeologist finds the lost city. He is able to, within reasonable confidence, determined that it was the lost city of Uruk, the home and the place where Gilgamesh ruled out of. And if he had found Uruk, then that means he was close to the tomb, which is something else that he also claimed to have found out at the place where the river Euphrates was. 1 month later, America goes to war with Iraq, Baghdad falls, the museum is left unguarded for days. And it's actually, I actually have the date pulled up here on this, and it was from, let's see here, April 10th through the 12th. So 2 whole days, 10 or 3, the day of the 10th, the 11th, and the 12th. 3 days to go in, get into whatever part of the museum you're trying to get access to, take whatever, and bail, and do it so effectively that there is nothing that can be connected to any specific country or company that would steal any kind of artifact related to Gilgamesh, the Resurrection Tomb, or ancient Sumeria, or even the Nephilim. Why do that? Of course, now we have these others, we have some other conspiracies. Some people say it was a Stargate. Now, I am not quite sold on the whole Stargate thing, simply because even if they did exist and the U.S. government or any government had gotten a hold of them, you would think that there'd be some sort of, visible telltale tale about them firing one off. You would think that there would be some sort of signature as to these devices being activated. So I'm not convinced on the whole Stargate thing. It's not outside the realm of possibility because, as being a former paranormal investigator, I have to at least be open-minded to possibility. But I'm also, as a former investigator, a man of evidence. And there just isn't enough evidence. Now, that doesn't mean that the lack of evidence means the lack of, the absence of evidence is not absence of the actual event, the Stargate, whatever it is. It just means I don't have enough to be able to make that decision. So what else would it be? Could it be something that would, point to the fact that the Nephilim carry a genetic coding that could extend life, that could make people into superhuman? Did they find the body of Gilgamesh and try to take his body to be able to extract whatever genetic material for whatever nefarious, human hybrid experimentation? And it's strange because no matter what, history tells us that the Nephilim are not pleasant people. So the idea that the American government is going to sit there and try to take the body of Gilgamesh, if that's what they found, take the body of Gilgamesh and try to create a whole new superhuman race, that can't end well. And if you really study out the history of the Nephilim, most of them were cannibals, which is one of the reasons why, if you look at the biblical account, Yahweh was so angry that he wanted to wipe out not just humanity, but the Nephilim, because the Nephilim were going around trying to destroy his creation. And it's not just about, forbidden knowledge. Because that's another misconception that a lot of people have. They think that, Yahweh was against humans having knowledge, which isn't true. Yahweh was against humans having the knowledge of good and evil. Because when you have a knowledge of good and evil, then you start to develop the knowledge for warfare. You start to have the knowledge of hatred. And this is something that was not supposed to be a part of us, but unfortunately it is now. And you can see that evidence all around the world. But why would the U.S. start a war with Iraq on sketchy claims of, oil, politics, and weapons of mass destruction, which we all know was, pretty loose to begin with? Why go to war with a country and mess around with an archaeological site? It just doesn't make sense unless there's something that they really wanted to take. So I am going to go through a comparison because I did a lot of research on this, and there's a lot of stuff that really caught me off guard, and I really wasn't expecting. So the comparison between Gilgamesh and the Nephilim of the Hebrew Bible or the Torah. Now, were they both superhuman in strength? Yes, on both of them. Were they both gigantic in size? Yes. Now there are some, variations as far as what that, how tall they were, and I think a lot of that has to do with maybe a slight misunderstanding in the translation between the methodology of measurement, uh, corruption, or tyranny. Both of them, yes. Now, in the Epic of Gilgamesh, it said that Gilgamesh started off as a ruthless tyrant and eventually would become, a little bit more docile, for lack of a better word. But they're both violent. They're both very brutal. They don't play around. Were Gilgamesh and the Nephilim both desiring immortality? Now, Gilgamesh sought immortality after Enkidu, which is, as I mentioned, the other supernatural being that the god created in an attempt to destroy Gilgamesh. But at some point in the tale, they both become friends. And then, of course, there are some Nephilim that are said to uh, persist post-flood, meaning that there is some sort of, I wouldn't necessarily say immortal or immortality to them, but there is a sense of longevity to them, which would make sense, which is why, a lot of times when you look at tales of giants, they're always ancient. They're always referred to as the ancient one, the old one. Role in pre-flood world. Gilgamesh lived a generation before the biblical flood. Okay, now this is where I mentioned, the Sumerians may have been the first one to write about the flood, but they're not the first one to actually know about it. And then, of course, with the Nephilim of the Bible, they are central to why the flood occurred. So the correlation, the parallel between Gilgamesh and the Nephilim is there's enough evidence to point to the possibility that Gilgamesh was, in fact, the same Nephilim that was mentioned in the Bible. And interestingly enough, the one place that we could probably find more information that would point to this is in a book that just isn't included in the Bible. And again, the Book of Enoch is not banned. It just isn't included. That's all that is. You can go anywhere and find copies of the Book of Enoch. Now, the reason why a lot of people have issues with the Book of Enoch is because, unlike the Epic of Gilgamesh, which is written by one, maybe two authors directly, and unlike most of the Bible, which is written firsthand by someone that is either in that moment or had witnessed it from afar off, or at least heard it from a first-person perspective from somebody that was there. The Book of Enoch was written by several people, and the copy that we do have was written so long after everything. It just makes it hard to validate it. Now, there are still some things about the Book of Enoch that gives it some credibility, and that's why a lot of scholars will say, it may not be a canonical text. It is still considered religious literature. It is still considered a holy teaching. And even the Hebrew, if you look at the Jews, they do teach on the Book of Enoch. That's just a part of their history. That's a part of their Torah. And you can also look at the Ethiopian Orthodox. Their Bible does include the Book of Enoch as one of the canon. And I will do a show on that another time because that's such an interesting topic about why the book of Enoch, the Bible that is in Ethiopia, contained the book of Enoch, but none of the other Bibles do. It has to do with several convention, meeting between bishops and other religious figureheads. But what do you think? What are your thoughts on this idea of the U.S. military or the U.S. government in general starting a war to go into an ancient land, steal artifact or whatever evidence, and then hide it? Now, here's why I know that there was a list that described the items that were missing. After the war ended, everything was all hush hush. Everything was, kind of murky. Mainstream media was going nuts with it. Politicians were all weird about it. And of course, the whole thing was just a disaster from start to finish. But in 2018, and I'm not going to say this woman's name because I'm not sure the legal ramifications of this, but in 2018, a woman using the FOIA, the Freedom of Information Act, to request the information or a copy of the list of what they believe was taken from the basement of the Baghdad Museum. Now, the response, as you might find interesting, the response she got back was denied. Not records don't exist, not incomplete record, just flat out denied. Of course, you're going to have some people out there, well, that just means that they didn't have it. No, if they didn't have it, they would say, we do not have these records. But they told her flat out, no, we will not show you that list. So if the government is not willing to share that list, then, several things. Number one, it would totally bring into question the legality of what they were doing out there. And two, again, it brings into question of what did they find and why was that so important? Why was it so important that they had to get all this stuff, all this information, all these artifacts? And who really pulled the string? Because I don't think George W. Bush had any clue what was really going on. I'm not even sure if the detachment that was out there at the archaeological site was there on any type of presidential authority. Was it the deep state? Was it the Illuminati? Who knows? But the only thing that can be proven is that there were people that witnessed U.S. Well, let me take that back. I can't even say that it was the U.S. military. All I can say is that they were wearing U.S. military driving U.S. vehicle. For all we know, they could have been some, Europeans. There could have been Russians. They could have been Asian. We don't know. The only thing that we can say is that there are written reports of people witnessing individuals wearing U.S. military uniforms on the archaeological site, taking things out of it in the middle of the night. We can confirm that the National Museum in Baghdad was left unguarded and that it was raided, not just by people looking for gold and everything else, but looking for something else that was more valuable than gold. Was it the key to immortality? Was it the key to understanding where we come from? Was it something else? These kind of theories, these kind of stories, these kind of conspiracy, these are the things that, will always fascinate us. But as I mentioned, a lot of this stuff is just theoretical. I can't prove it. I'm not going to say that it is absolutely true. But golly, makes you wonder, don't it? So again, if Gilgamesh was one of the Nephilim mentioned in the Bible, if he really did have a tomb of resurrection, if they really did find it, if they took all of this stuff, what is the end game here? Are we involved? I doubt it, because we all know the history of the ruling class. The one who has the most money, the one who has the most influence, has the most control, gets all the benefits while the rest of us struggle. So I'm going to leave this show at that, and I appreciate every one of you that been coming in and checking this out, and those of you that will watch this or listen to this later on. If you wouldn't mind, down in the description below, I do have links to all of my social media platforms and video and channels that you can check out. Share, subscribe, like, all that good stuff, because I cannot make this successful on my own. I need all of your help. No show is successful without its audience. And if you got some ideas that you would like for me to talk about, please drop me a line. I would be more than happy to kind of look into what your thoughts are, and I'll do some research. And if I can make a show out of it, I will. And tell you what, I'll even do one better. If I pick your idea for a story, I will have you be the co-host of that episode that night. So if that's something you're interested in, drop me a line. So yeah, I think that's it for me and my bizarre rambling. I think I will call that a show and wrap it up here with the same thing I say on every show. Be smart, be safe, and be kind to one another, because you never know. Your one act of kindness might change somebody's life. And as always, stay weird, people.